Thank you, Özyeğin, for that introduction. Dr. Pennebaker, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm ready. So it's an honor to be here. I visited Istanbul once and loved it. And sorry, I can't be there to present in person. What I wanted to do today is to essentially give kind of an overview of the research I've done over the last 30 or 40 years that gives more of a context in terms of the nature of the work that I do. I started off, I'm a social psychologist by training, and I never had frankly, any particular interest in clinical psychology or language or whatever. But as my career moved forward, I started to stumble into different areas. And part of what I'd like to do today is just give you a sense of the way that I think about psychology and the way I think about research. As you're going to see, my approach is maybe somewhat different than what you've been trained about in some classes. I think certainly when I was in college, the idea in psychology is that this is a very scientific field. And by this science, you come up with a hypothesis, you have a theory, and then you test the theory to see if your theory is right. And if it's not right, then it's obviously something's the matter with the experiment. And you go back and you do this same study over and over until, by God, you get those results that are consistent with your theory. And that's one way to do science. But there's another way to do science as well. And that is to start off with how the world is put together. I think this might be going on. And then you go and you do an experiment and it comes out completely backwards. And my approach is, whoa, the world is more complex and more interesting than I thought. I wonder why I'm finding this. And I can use that to build a theory. But the idea is for me, a theory is really, it's really a glorified hypothesis. It's something that guides you in terms of what you do next. In other words, I would encourage you, whether you end up becoming a researcher or a clinician or anything else, to always think about what might be guiding things, but look around the world and look at your experiences and use those to guide your what you do next. Use that to guide the theories and hypotheses that you generate. But through all of this, be scientific. Actually measure what you think is going on. And therein is one of the biggest problems that I think all of us make, which is we do something and one person says, oh, what you did was great. And it could be that that's the only person on earth who thinks that. You need to measure to see, are you bringing about change in ways that you think or hope you're doing? Okay, so I started off in psychology because I was, among other things, interested in the nature of health and when people get sick and why. And from there, I was focusing on physical symptoms and sensations and how you come to know your internal state. And I did a survey. I was putting together my first book, and I was trying to figure out how people come to notice how they feel. But then it occurred to me, well, I should just pass out a questionnaire to a large number of people and just get a sense, are people who report physical symptoms, headaches, upset stomachs, etc., do they have different life experiences? Is there some personality factors or other issues that could help explain why some people report more symptoms than others? And working with some undergraduate students, we just sat around the table coming up with ideas to ask people. Because I basically said, look, I want us just to ask anything that you think might be interesting or might be relevant. And one of my students said, ooh, I've got an idea. Let's ask if people had ever had a traumatic sexual experience. Now, this was in the early 1980s, and nobody in psychology ever asked that question. And quite frankly, very few people do now. So the question was, prior to the age of 17, did you have a traumatic sexual experience such as incest, rape, molestation, or something like that. And we ended up passing out the questionnaire to about 800 female students, and 15% said yes. And what we discovered was those people who endorsed that item had more health problems than any other group that we had ever seen. They went to the doctor more, or the student health center. They had, and I was fascinated why this might be the case. And at that about the same time, I ended up being involved with a magazine, and they were going to be doing a survey on physical symptoms, which I was studying. And I said, put that question on and a few others. And that we ended up getting 24,000 responses from that newspaper survey. This was not a random survey, but later studies found the same thing. 22% of and 11% of men reported having had a traumatic sexual experience prior to age 17. And those who endorsed it were twice as likely to have been hospitalized for any cause in the previous year. They were more likely to have been diagnosed with cancer, high blood pressure, ulcers, colds, flus, major problems, minor problems, than people who had not traumatic sexual experience. And this made me wonder, what is it about a traumatic sexual experience that's so dangerous or toxic in terms of physical health? Because one thing we also discovered was people who endorsed having a traumatic sexual experience frequently told us that they had never told anybody about this before. So here was a traumatic experience that was also secret. So we did some more surveys, and what we found was it wasn't having a traumatic sexual experience per se. Rather, it's having any kind of major trauma that you keep secret that was associated with health problems. Holding in, keeping a secret from others in your family and those around you is a toxic health risk. And that made me start to wonder, if this is so dangerous, what would happen if we brought people into the laboratory and essentially asked them to talk about or write about this traumatic experience, traumatic secret experience? Would that improve their physical health? It was a very simple idea. So the problem was I couldn't ask them to talk, because who would they talk to? And so I thought, we'll just have them write. So I got people in the laboratory, and by a flip of a coin, we asked them to write either about the most traumatic experience that they had ever had that they had not talked to other people about much, or they were asked to write about superficial topics. And what we did was I decided to have people write for 4 days, 15 minutes a day on 4 consecutive days. So we would essentially line up all of these students, and we would sign them up 5 or 10 minutes apart. They'd come into my office and I'd talk to them and tell them about the experiment. And then by flip of a coin, we then sent them to a room where they would write either about a trauma for 4 days, or they'd write about a superficial topics. And it was just 15 minutes a day. And we also got permission from them for us to track their student health center records. In other words, their doctor visits. And this was I was at a university at the time that they had an office right in the university, and most of the students lived at the university, so it was very close by. What we found in that very first study was stunning. What we discovered was that people who were asked to write about the most traumatic experience of their lives ended up going to the doctor at about half the rate as people in our control groups, the people who were asked to write about superficial topics. In other words, merely writing about a traumatic experience made people healthier, if you like. They went to the doctor less. And this study was so striking for me, because I've discovered something else. Is over the next year, I would walk around campus, and sometimes people who were in the experimental group would stop me and they'd say, Dr. Pennebaker, I want to thank you for that experiment that you let me be in last year. It changed my life. Now, I can tell you, I had run lots of experiments, and I had never been told that an experiment had changed their life. And that study got me involved to start thinking more deeply. what is it about writing? Is it working because it's changing the immune system? What's going on? And what we discovered was we did a subsequent study with Janice Kiko Glaser and her husband, Ron Glaser, who is a immunologist. And they were starting to do some early work in psychoneuroimmunology. And what we did was, in our next study, we drew blood from people. And then after we drew blood, they were randomly assigned to either the experimental group to write about traumas or a superficial topic to write about as a control. And then they wrote for 4 days, and then we drew blood again, and then again 6 weeks later. And what we found was that writing about traumatic experiences brought about changes in physical health, as we had found initially, but it also was associated with enhanced immune function. So this method of expressive writing was bringing about some significant changes. And now the floodgate was open. Other labs started looking at this. We started looking at this, trying to figure out what is it about writing that makes a difference. And this question it continues to go on, and I'll give you kind of an overview of that literature now. There have now been well over 1,000 expressive writing studies. And there have been, to my knowledge, at least 6 or 7, maybe even 8 meta-analyses on expressive writing. And we know that it works, but it's a modest effect. For those of you into the statistics of a study, the effect size, or the Cohen's t, is about a 0.13 to 0.16. So these are not huge effects, but they're pretty consistent, and they're associated with all sorts of health problems, behavior changes, and so forth. It seems to work for a number of reasons. One is merely labeling an event seems to be important. And part of it is when you sit down and write about something that you haven't talked about, you are labeling it, you're labeling your feelings, but in interesting ways, you are publicly acknowledging that this thing happened to you. The next thing is it changes the way you organize the event. Once you put something into words, it changes the structure of it. You start thinking of it differently. And one way I often think about this is all of us have had horrible experiences. And a lot of times you're embarrassed by them, or you will think you might hurt somebody else's feelings. If you talk about them, there are all sorts of reasons we don't talk about it. But what you do is you'll be walking down the street, and then all of a sudden you'll think of some part of it. Oh, I should have told that person such and such. And then you walk a little bit further and some other thing up. Oh man, this is going to really screw me in terms of my grades, or whatever. In other words, you think about certain features of it, you mull over it for a few minutes, and then you go forward. But you never bring all those parts of this event into one story. And once you do this expressive writing, it forces you to bring some kind of structure to it. It forces you to organize it. And then there's some other issues as well. One thing that this is doing is it's helping you to understand it, to find meaning to it. And what that means now is you don't obsess about it as much. And we also know from expressive writing that you'll sleep better. And sleep is one of these understudied things in psychology. That is, when people are able to sleep more, they are less depressed, there's better immune function, we know, and it also allows you to have greater working memory. There's been a lot of studies looking at this idea of working memory. The ability just to think more complexly allows you to multitask better, and that with expressive, it kind of opens us up. And one other thing it does is changes our social relationships. I was involved in a series of studies where we gave people a tape recorder, and with a lapel mic, and the lapel mic would go on for 30 seconds, and then it would go off for 7 or 12 minutes, depending on the study. And we'd have them wear this for 2 days before writing, a month after writing. So we could just track their social lives over days. And what we found was that people in the expressive writing group, on questionnaires, they said, nope, it hasn't had any effect on my social life. It hasn't had any effect on the way I'm thinking. But what we found was, in terms of these objective measures, They talked more compared to controls. They laughed more. They used more positive emotions. They were more socially connected with other people. In other words, the power of this expressive writing was it changes the way you thought. It changed the way that you could connect with others, because now your mind is freer. You could be a better friend. You could listen to the people more closely. In other words, it's bringing about all of these changes. Now, one of the things that grew out of this, it was this idea of, could we get a better sense of how people are changing their thinking by just analyzing their writing samples? So think about this. We asked people to write about a traumatic experiences for 4 days, and they would turn in what they had written. Their names would not be linked to it, but we'd still be able to link their questionnaires with their writing samples and also the health record. And what we would then do is I would give these essays to clinical psychologists and have them rate the essays. To what degree is this person understanding their situation? To what degree is this person emotionally distressed? To what degree is this person putting together a good, coherent story? So we now had hundreds of these essays, and it took this large group of these were mostly graduate students in clinical psychology. It took them a long time to grade them and to rate them. And here's what we discovered. First of all, the raters didn't agree on anything. One person would say, oh, yes, this person really understands the problem they're in. Another person will say, this person's an idiot. They don't understand anything. And then one person would say, oh, this is a very coherent, logical story. The other person would not. And I just saw that the chat bot said that you can raise your hands. I can't see hands. So if somebody else wants to serve as a moderator and say, oh, somebody has a question, just go ahead and call them.
Dr. Pennebaker, I'll help you out with that when the time comes.
Excellent. Okay. So we know with all of this, what I want to do is, so judges don't agree with her, and it took a long time, but it also depressed these judges. Reading lots of traumatic stories is really emotionally taxing. So here we were making our judges depressed. It took them forever, and they didn't agree on one another. And so that's when I decided. I had taken a little bit of computer science in college, and I thought, well, let's just buy a computer program to analyze text. And to my surprise, there wasn't one. So working with one of my graduate students at the time, Martha Francis, what we ended up doing was to write a computer program. And the computer program was called Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, LIWC. And it's written primarily in English, but there are now multiple language translations, and I believe there's one in Turkish. However, I actually think what works even better than using, say, the Turkish dictionary or any other one is to run, let's say you have a bunch of essays or speeches or whatever that is in Turkish, and you want to run them through Luke. I would just run them through Google Translate and then run the English version of Luke on it. And primarily because the Turkish version of Luke, just as the Arabic and Spanish and French, just doesn't work as well as the English version. Primarily, it takes forever to build these translations. In any case, the Luke program would go through and analyze text in multiple ways. So, for example, it would analyze count the words that were in a text that were, say, anger words. These would be words like hate, anger, kill, murder, all sorts of words associated with anger. And there's its sadness dictionary and a positive emotion dictionary, et cetera. And to come up with these dictionaries, we had to get groups of judges to go through and evaluate what words in the English language were words that suggested anger and sadness, et cetera. But once you do this, you have to do more than just emotion words. We also had cognitive words. And these cognitive words were words like causal words like because, cause, effect, reason, rationale, or insight words, words like understand, meaning, getting at the ways people think. And then as long as we were doing this, we got parts of speech like pronouns, you, me, I, he, she, or prepositions, to, of, for, words such as that. So here we had this computer program that would go into any given text, look for all these dimensions of language and give us feedback in terms of to what degree is this text revealing these different dimensions that we thought might be psychologically relevant. Well, a few things came out. First of all, we could start to see who would benefit through their use of language. And what we found didn't match anything I was expecting. First of all, I thought that the more that people express negative emotions, the more they would benefit. No, people who wrote kind of a moderate number of negative emotion words benefited the most. Positive emotion words, it turned out the more that people wrote positive emotion words like love, joy, happy, benefited more than those who did not. Even if they said, no one loves me, I'm not happy, I feel no joy. Those people, ironically, were better off than someone who said, I'm sad, miserable, etc. Because if they said they were not happy, they were still thinking along that dimension of happiness. They're not happy, but they're not saying they're sad. That's a different psychological state. But those two dimensions were really small compared to another dimension. And these were these cognitive words. These cognitive words, we call them cognitive process words now, include those causal words and insight words and other words that tell us that people are thinking. And it worked in a way that I didn't understand at the time, which was those people who benefited the most started off using those cognitive words at low levels and then increased over the course of their writing. In other words, the more they do it, the more they were trying to figure out, why did this happen? What's going on? How can I make a difference? In other words, there was this change in cognitive processing. And then there was another thing that was going on as well. The people who benefited also changed in their perspective. That is, one day they would talk about their feelings. I feel this, I was doing this, I'm thinking this. And the next day they are talking about other people. Well, I'm worried about my sister because she's thinking this, and I wonder if she's upset, blah, blah, blah. And then maybe flipping back to I, but going back and forth from I words to other kind of pronouns. In other words, this flipping of perspective was a reflection or a marker of improved physical health. But there was another side to this that was the most interesting, and that was this computer program had opened up a new world for me that I never would have expected. And that is, I started to discover that the words that people were using were reflecting their psychological state. It was almost like a personality, that different people used words in different ways. And again, it didn't make sense the way that I was expecting it. And specifically, I would, every night after I developed this program, I would go online, and this was just in the early days of the internet, and would download these chat logs that I got. There was a very popular program at the time, America Online. And I was able to go to these chat logs, download them, and then the next morning I would analyze them. And what I was discovering was that language didn't work the way I thought. So for example, I thought, okay, pretty obvious that men and women talk differently, and they do. And I thought men would use I words more, I, me, and my, because, they're arrogant and self-important. Women would use emotion words more because they're more emotional. Men would use cognitive words more because they're more logical. Women would use we, or we, us, and our more because they're more communal, and would use social words more. Well, I've gone around the world. In fact, I think I may have done this even in Turkey. It turns out everybody has those stereotypes. and they're all but one of them are completely wrong. Women use I words more than men do. But you say, but men are more arrogant, self-important, and narcissistic. That is true, but they don't use I words more. I words don't reflect arrogance and self-importance. I words reflect self-focus. So more aware of your emotions, more aware of your internal state. And I words are associated with other things. When people get depressed, both men and women, they look internally more. If you're physically sick, it draws your attention inward. So whenever your attention is focused on yourself, you automatically start using I words more. And so a person who's depressed will use I words while they're depressed, but when they're not depressed, they will not use I words at high rates. And these are really trustworthy kinds of effects. We words, we, us, and our. These don't always mean you and me together, we love one another. We words also mean other things. So in fact, there's no difference between men and women in the use of the way they use we, or how frequently they use we. Women tend to use it a little bit more in terms of you and me together. But we is also used in this way that I talk to my students. So I'll talk to my students and I'll say, hey guys, I need to analyze this data. Now, that doesn't really mean, hey, you and I, we're going to hold hands and we're going to analyze this data. It really means you guys analyze the data. In other words, we sometimes really means you, or we sometimes mean everybody. It's this kind of way of kind of protecting ourselves. So if I did something bad with my friends, I'll say, yeah, we did this, as opposed to saying I was involved. And another thing that came up were articles and prepositions. Articles A, N, and the, huge sex differences. Men use those words at higher rates than women. Why? Because when you are talking about objects and things, nouns, you need to have articles and prepositions at higher rates. And women actually use more social words. So in terms of he, she, they. Why? Because they're generally more interested in other human beings, which means men are interested in objects and things, women are interested in human beings. And consequently, if you're interested in human beings, you use fewer articles and prepositions. And this brings us to the cognitive words. We use cognitive words when we're trying to understand incredibly complex issues. And there's nothing more complex than trying to understand other people. Why is this person dating that person when it makes no sense? Everybody knows that they don't belong together. And it's because you're using all these cognitive words. When you're trying to understand why a motor doesn't work, it's not really that complicated. Humans are complicated. Now, all of this takes me to why this is interesting. It's because it's telling us how people work and how they're thinking. And we can now start to analyze any kind of text. It could be conversation. It could be a Zoom call. Zoom data is awesome. We're starting to get into that. It could be diaries. It could be speeches. It could be essays, but it could also be social media. And all of these types of data can tell us about people. So we've done these studies showing that we can identify depressed versus non-depressed people. We can identify people who are lying versus telling the truth. Not at great rates. We do better than humans do, but it's not that this isn't a lie detector test that you should trust too much. We can look at this in terms of status, high status people versus low status people. It's right there in language. You can pick it up immediately once I tell you how to do it. And we can now start to look at how people are connecting with one another. If I start using these small words, by the way, all these words like pronouns and prepositions and articles, there are not that many in language. The more that you are using these words, these small words at rates similar to somebody else, your language is matching. We call this language style matching. And we can analyze any given interaction and see how closely two people are in sync with one another. And it predicts who will go on dates using speed dating. We've analyzed couples who are dating at the time, and we analyze their text messages with each other. We can predict if they're going to be in a relationship 6 months from now much, much better than they can by just seeing how much they match in their language. Now, the place that I'm most excited about right now is big data. We've been analyzing, I have a wonderful research team that's been doing some, I think, unbelievable work. And some of this we're looking at, can we track, let's say, relationships over time by the way people are using language? And one place we can do this is on this social media platform, Reddit. I don't know if Reddit is popular in Turkey. I suspect there are other forums that are like this. These are essentially this giant forum. Reddit has 180,000 subreddits. And basically, people just go to these subreddits, they're little communities, and they could be formed around a football team. They could be around a TV show or a music group or specific issues in terms of having a child, cooking, etc. One of them is on breakups, relationship breakups. And people will often go there to talk about how they've just been dumped by their girlfriend or boyfriend, or how they just was able to get out of a relationship, or asking questions, how can I tell my boyfriend or girlfriend that I want out, things like that. So what we did was we went into this Reddit and we found thousands and thousands of people who have posted that they have just broken up. And we lined all of these up to this particular day when they had broken up. So we lined them all up on the same day. And then we're able to go back and track everything that they've posted in the year before and the year after their breakup. And we're able to look at not just the posts in the breakup Reddit, but in all their other places where they're talking. In fact, the average person only posted in this breakup Reddit 3 times, and they posted in other communities 140 times. So we can track how they're thinking. And heck, let's go ahead and I'll start my PowerPoint presentation now. You can see I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint. Okay, this is the way that it started. Okay, now you see that. Oh, and I want to just point out that the people who've been involved with a lot of this research are my collaborators, Sara Swaraj, Ashwini Ashakumar, and Kate Blackbird. Oh, look, that's the monthly health center data. Pretty cool. Here's the computer program, linguistic inquiry and word count. And this is the breakups project. Well, what we did was, one thing we looked at is this analytic thinking. Analytic thinking is a group of words that we can identify that captures logical, formal, hierarchical thinking. It's associated with IQ. It's associated also with changes that you see when people are undergoing stress. And we have 2 sets of lines here, the red line and the blue line. The red line includes all relationship posts. The blue line are just posts that have nothing to do with relationships. So these are where people are talking about their football team or whatever. And what you can see, this takes us to about 3 months before the breakup. And what you see is, even though these people, a large percentage of them, claim to be completely shocked that they were dumped, you see that they start to get stupider starting 3 months before the breakup. And it peaks during the actual breakup, the week of the breakup, and then it takes people 6 months to get back to baseline, which I find absolutely fascinating. At the same time, we can look at the cognitive process words. I told you about these. These are words where people are trying to work through what's going on. And again, you see the same general pattern starting about 3 months before. People are starting to, their minds working more and more everywhere, trying to understand what's going on in their lives. It peaks when they break up. And then again, 6 months later, they drop to baseline, and ironically afterwards, they drop below that, which is a sign of they're getting healthier. This looks at anger on the left side, and this is a much messier graph, but you see that, again, starting about 3 months before, their anger drop for the breakup. They're trying to, I think, psychologically distance themselves and trying to control their emotions. And then they get to the breakup day, and whew, now they get furious over the next 4 or 5 months. Anxiety is tracking this as well, starting 3, 4 months before. Anxiety levels in their language start to increase quite a bit. And again, it takes quite a while for them to return to normal. I want to just very briefly mention 2 other projects that give you a sense of ways to start thinking about language on this much broader level. This is looking at COVID, and this is COVID in the United States. This is the timeline. This project was based on Reddits of people in communities in the United States, about 18 different cities. And so we're just tracking everything these people say. And these are the percentage of posts that mention COVID. And you can see in there in the middle, which is when the quarantining started here in the United States, over 10% of all the Reddits over the next several months mention COVID. This takes us back, this goes to thinking styles. And we're able to go back to 2011, so 10 years ago, looking at the average level of analytic thinking. This is that one that's logical, formal thinking. And keep in mind, this is dealing with millions of posts. And what you see here, as soon as COVID starts, look at this unbelievable drop. This is a cultural shift. The entire culture went stupid. And I guarantee you, the same thing happened in Turkey, same thing happened in every place on earth. Everybody became so disoriented by it. We started thinking differently. We started losing things and so forth. Cognitive processing, remember, this is the one where you're trying to understand what's going on. We see a big jump afterwards. Negative emotions, you'll see that there's a giant jump in anxiety. With anger, ironically, when this happened, there was a big drop in anger, which went against what everybody believed happened. There's another story to this, and that is, as you know, in the United States, and also to some degree around the world, the murder of George Floyd brought about huge changes in the ways we, in the United States, are having to rethink issues of race and the way that particularly Blacks in the United States have been treated. And what we became interested in is, was this affected at all by COVID as well? So if you look at this graph here on the left, you'll see 10 weeks before the 0 is when George Floyd was killed. This point here, where you see the dotted line, is COVID, when COVID started. And we've already shown that analytic thinking dropped like crazy when COVID started, but it was not affected much by George Floyd's death. In other words, people were still thinking in the same, in logical ways. Over here, by the way, the dark blue line is this year. We had a control year. I don't have time to get into that. With cognitive processing, we see that initially there was a big increase, that as you've seen before, but you see another big increase with George Floyd's death. Anxiety on the left, we've already seen that COVID was associated with a giant jump in anxiety, and with George Floyd's death, it had very little effect. But look over on the right. Remember how I talked that there was that drop in anger with COVID? And there we see that drop in anger, which was actually at the time a big effect. Look what happened in these 18 cities in terms of anger-related words with George Floyd's death. There was an explosion. I have never seen an increase that matches that even anywhere by any amount. And that was continuing on 10 to 12 weeks. We're now studying this as we move up to the anniversary. So you can see with everything I've been telling you, the ability for us to think about language in new ways is we have access to psychological principles through language in ways no one ever would have imagined 20 years ago. And, I trace my own march through all of this, going from stumbling on this work that took me into the nature of expressive writing with no major theory or ideas. I had some great theories, some of them were completely wrong, but got me into this expressive writing, finding that expressive writing, that language, it can be really powerful in bringing about cognitive change that influences physical and mental health. And then discovering out of nowhere that by looking at language, there's so much more there for us as psychologists and human beings to understand ourselves. That is, by looking at language use in words, and especially these function words, we can get a sense of how we are connecting with others, how we are thinking about ourselves, how we are related to the topics we're talking about. And we can use this at the individual level, but we can also look at this at a broader, at a family level, a company level, a city level, an entire cultural level. And we also have access wherever we have words. It gives us insight to historical events. We can now look at things that were occurring, in World War I, or going back in time in terms of how the culture was thinking, by looking at magazine articles, by looking at diaries, by looking at speeches, etc. Wherever there is a language record, we can start to get at the psychological and social factors underneath what the writer was thinking and feeling. So let me stop here and open this up for questions and discussions.
Dr. Pennebaker, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I'm sure you've inspired many individuals here. We're going to have lots of questions, I'm sure, from quite a few people. Before the session, our psychology club also had individuals submit questions as well. So we also have some of those questions in addition to what individuals are going to post in the chat. So we'll have a mixture of both of those if some people want to ask live questions, and then some of the questions that have been submitted. So one second, let me start with one of the questions we have, and then I'll go through the chat box. We have a really interesting question about secrets. So the author of this question wrote, do you think secrets are even more detrimental for health for some people with substance issues or a gambling addiction? Also, they're asking about family history. And when there's family secrets, do you think that secrets in families can pass on from one generation to another and affect health that way?
So secrets they're a double-edged sword. We keep secrets for a good reason, because honestly, sometimes if you are keeping a secret and other people knew about it, they'd shun you, they'd stone you, you or somebody would get arrested. I mean, there are all sorts of good reasons why we keep secrets. But the flip side of it is that secrets poison a relationship, because, the very first time I became aware of this was with that traumatic sexual experience questionnaire. And I ended up talking with a woman who told me a story that lives with me today. And that was, she had been sexually molested by her mother's second husband. And she'd never seen her mother had been divorced when this woman was relatively young. The mother finally remarried, and she had never seen her mother more happy. And then the guy she married started sneaking in at night and molesting her. And she knew she couldn't tell her mother because it would break her heart. She couldn't tell the other kids at school. She was about 14 at the time, because they would never understand it. And so now she was holding this giant secret back, and her relationship with her mother went to hell, because she couldn't be honest with her mother. She couldn't be honest with her friend. And you saw how her entire network, just collapsed. And so when we get secrets like that, they are poisonous. In terms of to secrets pass along families, families are so interesting. If you're a psychologist, man, and you're interested in families, they are puzzles because every family has its own ways of doing things. And it's true, every family has its own secrets. You've got this person who, did something or was, if it came out, it would humiliate the entire family. So everybody keeps it secret. And then the next generation comes along and we're not going to be talking about old grandpa or grandma because that could be humiliating. And then it just goes on. So in a sense, yeah, secrets can flow forward. How do you deal with it? It depends on the case.
Thank you for that answer. We have a great question also in our chat box. So Asmin, would you like to ask the question yourself, or if not, I will read it. Okay.
Hi, I can ask it. I wonder, you mentioned that based on the similarity of the conversation of potential couples, you could make prediction about their future relationships, like how it's going to end in 6 months' time, even though they are not aware of that. So I wonder, how you analyze those tags between the couples and predict the relationship? Like, what do you do? Like, what do you look at? What kind of parameters do you use?
So that project is one I did with Richard Slatcher and Molly Ireland and others. That particular project, there were 86, these were college students. So they were all 18, 19 years old, and they had come to college and they were all had been dating for at least 6 months. And to be in the study, they had to agree to give us 10 days of their instant messages, IMs, or which are similar to text messages or SMS. And so that was the project. And what we did was we asked them, among other things, to tell us about their relationship. How good do you get along? How likely do you think you'll be together in the future, and so forth. Turns out people are remarkably stupid about the future of their relationship. They can't tell for all sorts of reasons. In any case, with that group, what we did was we analyzed the 10 days of text messages. And with that, we use this algorithm, we call it language style matching, looking at the degree to which the two people are using prepositions at the same rate, articles the same rate, pronouns at the same rate, and so forth. And we come up with a number that goes from 0 to 1.0. And what we did was just did a median split between those that were high in language style matching and low. So we just went at the middle and we looked at the top half of the LSM and the bottom half. In the top half, that is that they were using language very similarly. 3 months later, 82% were still dating. Those in the bottom half, only about 52% were still dating. In other words, what's so interesting about this, and by the way, studying young college students' relationships, it's the perfect age group because they're in really unstable relationships. And as a researcher, you really want unstable relationships because it gives you're able to study things better. So what this is essentially doing is, to give you an example, I went in later and looked at some of the low LSM ones. And what was interesting about it was you'd read these instant messages and you and I would look at it and say, God, what a horrible relationship. But then you go back and look at their questionnaires and they say, oh, our relationship is great, but it wasn't. So it's not as though this is magic. It's more that I think all of us put on blinders when we're in early part of a relationship. We try not to see the miserable things, focusing on the good. I'll give you one other story. I was contacted by somebody years ago after this was published. And she wrote and said, look, I'd like to know what my LSM is with this guy that she had dated some. And so I said, well, I usually don't do this, but I did it. And you'd look at it, and she had started dating this person in a particular location, and they afterwards she had sent him a text messages saying, oh man, it's so great seeing you, blah blah blah. And he wrote back, yeah, it was really good. And then the next one would be she would try to draw him out, and he'd say very little. Anybody would have looked at that and said, he's just not that into you. But she didn't see it. And sure enough, the LSM was very low. And so I said, look, I just looking at the numbers, I would not put a whole lot of stock in the future of this relationship.
Okay, can I ask one more follow-up question?
Let's try to limit it to, we'll allow this one, but let's not ask a lot of follow-ups so that we can allow more participants to ask their question. Go ahead.
Okay. So is it basically based on the grammatical use of the language? So it could not?
No, well, kind of, but it's stupider than that. The language approach I have is an embarrassing one. Linguists, when they first heard about my work, they were just, oh my God, doesn't this loser understand that language is all contextual? Well, the issue is that all I'm doing is just counting words. So yes, it's grammatical, but it's more what these words are reflecting. So they're reflecting a broader psychological issue. So I don't care. I don't care if it's a preposition in the sense that a linguist would. A linguist would say, okay, you're using this preposition to, thus, versus for, versus of, etc. And they each have different meanings in terms of relationship to the body and so forth. My attitude is, who cares? They're all prepositions. That's good enough for me. So mine, I don't think I would consider it grammatical, even though I'm looking at grammatical markers.
Okay,
More than, of course, syntactical ones. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. We have a question from Simge now.
Hello all. First of all, Professor Pennebaker, thank you for your insightful presentation. I'm indeed very interested in languages, both in the aspect of learning, especially bilingual learning, and perceiving languages. So it was quite amazing for me, this presentation. Your presentation reminded me of a thing that I've been recently thinking a lot. You said that the words people are using actually reflects their psychological status. And I actually realized that I'm kind of like echoing the other people's words to them, like what words do you use, whether they are using complex or simpler words, structures, etc. So I was wondering, what do you think about a study design like with this echo effect, like we are reflecting their own structures, and can we actually measure like empathy aspect or maybe mirror neuron aspect of this equation, kind of like this system? Thank you.
That's a wonderful question. And it's one that I've been interested in a lot for the last several years. First of all, this style matching does show the degree to which two people, when they get into an interaction, one that they're connecting with, really do use language remarkably similar. It's almost as though once two people are in a engrossing conversation, it's almost as though they take on a mind. That is, that their language usually isn't just reflecting one person's language versus the others. It's some kind of new configuration. Now, this, of course, is assuming that both people are very much into it. If one of the two people isn't paying attention much, what you find is that the style matching often will drop. It's a little bit more complex than that. But it does raise some very interesting questions in terms of how does your personality change when you're talking to one person versus another person? And I think all of us shift some when we're talking to one person versus another. I'm guessing many of you have had this experience. You talk to somebody from a different part of the country and they have a different accent, and all of a sudden you notice you're using an accent a little bit like theirs, even though you don't even speak with that accent normally. It's just something that we naturally do. And it's like a grown-up talking to a child. Very often adults will start talking like children when they're talking to children. So I do think that there is something to what you're saying, and it's a very rich topic that we don't know a lot about. So if you're interested in that as a research topic, that would be a great one.
Thank you for that. Our next question is, does writing have an impact on momentarily for relaxing, or is it effective to heal long-term traumas? And in which ways could writing aid in resolving and processing loaded memories or traumas?
I think writing can be used for both short-term and long-term gain in different ways. So, for example, I don't write very often. When I'm going through a difficult time, and often I'll wake up in the middle of the night and I'll start thinking about some disagreement I had at school or with a friend, and I'll start obsessing about it. And then I'll get up and I'll go and I'll write about it. And more times than not, at some point, I'll just get bored with writing, go back and go right to sleep. So that would be a good example of a short-term gain. Others have a bigger impact. So if I'm trying to decide what do I want to do with my career, or why are things not going well at this job, or fundamental issues going on in my relationship, getting up and writing, and sometimes writing for 2 or 3 days for me, can really help to kind of crystallize or organize my thoughts. So I think writing can be used in both ways. And I should tell you, my experiments, I have people write for 3 or 4 days, 15 minutes a day. There's no magic about that. Sometimes I write for myself just once. Sometimes I write and there've been a study showing that people can benefit by writing 2 minutes a day. And I've done some kind of preliminary experiment where you have people just write in the air with their fingers. In other words, try different ways. It's free, and when you're finished writing, you can throw it away, you can keep it. I would not recommend leaving it out for others to read. But the point is the important issue is translating complex emotional experiences into language is really the important rule.
Thank you for that. We also have a question from one of our faculty members, Ayfer Hoca.
Dr. Pennebaker, thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I was wondering if there are any differences between writing for yourself, like in a diary, like knowing that no one is going to read it, and disclosing someone else in writing, in terms of both the processes and the healing effect.
So that's again, one of these critical questions. There hasn't been any groundbreaking studies comparing the two. However, there was one study that, I had written years ago that I felt as though writing, let's say, on a blog in deeply personal manners would not be as healthy as writing for yourself. And then somebody had the audacity to question that. And they did a study, this was done in Israel, where they had people either write in a blog versus write on a blog place that no one else would read. And they found that people benefited just as much from the public blog as from the private. So it turns out my original idea may well be wrong. I think the way I think about this is the kind of feedback that you get. If you write about something or you talk about it with somebody close, if they accept you, if they validate what you say, then I think actually talking might even be better than writing. The killer problem is if you tell somebody and then they question your reality, they punish you for it in one way or another, which, by the way, happens a lot in cases of people who've had a sexual trauma. They tell their parents and their parents deny it. That, I think, is far worse than if you just kept it secret.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We also have one comment in our chat box. Unfortunately, she's in a loud area, so she can't express it herself. But she wanted to say that she's so thankful from the bottom of her heart. I'm sorry, it moved on me, for your method, because it's totally changed her life. And she's such a big fan of you and wants to let you know that she loves you so much.
Well, thank you very much. That something like that just makes me feel good. Thanks so much.
It looks like we also have a question from Denise. Denise, would you like to say your question out loud?
If I'm hearable.
You are.
I was going to ask if people writing the diary since childhood, they have a better resilience. Can we say that?
That is a great question. I would have said yes, but all the data says no. In fact, when we've done studies, and I know at least one was published, showing that people who write in diaries or journals every day have worse health than people who don't. But that would be like saying people who go to the doctor are more unhealthy than people who don't go to the doctor, or people who take vitamins are sicker than people who don't take vitamins, which turns out to be true. And it's not that going to a doctor makes you sick or taking vitamins makes you sick, although sometimes it might, nor does writing make you sick. When people are distressed, they're more likely to write in diaries. If they are having health problems, they're more likely to go to a doctor. If they're having health problems, they're more likely to take vitamins. So there is no evidence that writing in a diary or journal over the course, every day is good for you. There really isn't. And one issue I always point to, one reason I've always liked expressive writing is because the idea is something's bothering you, you go, you write it, you get it over with, and then move on. One issue is writing about something over and over and over and over and over again is almost the definition of a depression. That is, that a person can get into this ruminative cycle and they're writing about these miserable things over and over and over, just picking at that scab. They can't get away from it. So if in journaling, part of it is, uplifting writing, poetry, whatever, great, but don't dwell on misery every day. I think that's not healthy.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We also, we just have a few more moments left because I believe, Dr. Pennebaker, we have about four more minutes of your time here. We have one question about how your process of writing could also be used in children in preschool who haven't yet developed writing abilities, or possibly those with disabilities who are not able to write.
So those are complicated questions. One problem is that there's been very few studies on writing with anybody under the age of 18 even, because, you know, I don't know what the laws are in Turkey, but in the United States, if a student or a child somehow acknowledges some kind of abuse or something like that, you know, we end up sending in SWAT teams. I mean, it's a really, really disruptive issue. So there have not been very many studies. There are a few studies suggesting that it can be beneficial. And even in therapy, it's the same issue with children, that if you can get the child to put upsetting events into words, telling a story, something like that, there is evidence that it's beneficial. What if the person can't write? There's some wonderful work by Alexander Luria and what the other famous clinical developmental psychologist in the Soviet Union who died in the 30s. Drives me nuts. Starts with a V. In any case, they were doing work in parts of Russia. This was after the Russian Revolution, dealing with entire communities where nobody was literate, and so they were going in, training them to write, and they would. They were doing some studies to see something about the nature of memory, because they hadn't studied people who were in non-literate cultures. And what they would do is they would tell these children, okay, I'm going to give you a series of names of objects, and I want you to write them down. And then afterwards, you tell me what called these things back. And these kids would say, hey, we don't know how to write. And they say, well, you know, you just move the pencil this way. So the kids would just put squiggles down for writing. And what they found, if they did that, is they remembered the objects better. And one of their arguments was that there was something inherent in writing, that it somehow changed the way it was organized. So even with little kids who don't write, or if somebody comes from a non-literate culture, some kind of symbolic movement associated with what they're doing might work, might be beneficial. I don't know of any research on it, but it could be interesting.
Thank you. And I have one last question that I would like to ask, and it may pertain to other people as well, as some of us may end up emailing you afterwards to ask you more questions. Mm-hmm. So you know so much about pronouns and all of these function words. When you get your own emails, because I sent you an email about 10 years ago and we had a wonderful meeting, which I appreciate. I spent probably an hour obsessing over the text in which I wrote the email, so there weren't too many I's and that there were we's and she's and all of this text. Do you actually look at any of your emails with your research in mind?
Never. And here's the other issue. I can sometimes tell when I get an email and it sounds just weird because it doesn't use I. And I know what they're doing, and I know they spent time on it. And I think, Jesus God, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. Because first of all, I can't notice it unless it sounds weird. And the reality is the way you naturally write reflects who you are. So I don't remember your email, but the reality is given that you were younger and higher status, I guarantee you use more I words than I did. But then you knew that, I words suggest that you're lower in dominance or whatever. Well, look, we're in an unequal relationship here. So when I write to people, when I write to the university president, I use lots of I words because that's just the nature of status differential. And I'm not being, I'm not some worm. That's the way I talk. And the university president will use fewer I words. And so when I wrote you, I bet I was nice. And so, but I didn't use a lot of I words. That's just the nature of language. So write naturally to other people. Don't worry about if you try to avoid I words, your correspondence just looks weird. So don't look weird.
I think that's one of our main take-home messages of your talk. Don't look weird.
Exactly.
Well, we've come up at the end of our time, and thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. You've obviously changed lives of our participants in this meeting. I'm sure those of us who are going through difficult times now will probably begin journaling to also try to help ourselves with dealing with COVID or any other traumas that they've experienced. So we thank you very much, and also to our psychology club who reached out to contact you, hoping that you would actually accept. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And this has been great for me to contact you all as well.
And we definitely invite you to Istanbul once pandemic is over. I know you've been before, but we would be more than happy to show you around again. And Tunahan, our president of PsychOz, would like to take a picture of everybody. So if you wouldn't mind taking just one quick picture with us, then we'll respect your time.
I am waiting 5 seconds to take. Okay. 3, 2, 1. One more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Pennebaker.
Thank you all. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Thanks. Thank you.
Bye-bye.